It's a great pleasure that I welcome Leslie back to Madison. She did her BA at Mills in Visual Communication and Design, and you'll see in her articles on photography and dress how that early background came into play. She did her MA in Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, and her PhD also at UC Berkeley in History and with a Southeast Asia focus. She did some teaching at at UC Berkeley, and then also at University of San Francisco, and served as managing editor for Asia Pacific Perspectives. Has done a fair amount of freelance copy editing, and something that all of you will want to note. She is now the founder of Origami Editorial, which is an academic development editing and book coaching group. So always good to know where to turn when one has projects like that. I personally am very indebted to Leslie for facilitating a meeting with Forrest McGill in San Francisco. And that meeting, I was working on the Vasantra Jataka book, and Forrest McGill I'm trying to remember the name of the museum.
That's the Asian Art Museum. Asian Art Museum in San Francisco.
Asian Art Museum in San Francisco. How hard is that to remember? Anyway, so he's a curator there, and he pulled out these amazing collection of paintings of the Vasantra Jataka, and allowed me to pick one of the bodiest that was easily reproducible, which appears in my book. So I owe that connection to Leslie. I am so excited that her book has come out. I always was amazed. I found it inspiring. The history of women tends to disappear because so many times the travelers to Asia were men, and they assumed that everything was happening with the men, so they'd focus on the king and the princes. And it was sort of only later that they realized that the only way they were going to get their business deal approved was if they got a contact with the queen or one of the influential princesses. So women tend to disappear in all of this. And Leslie's work has been an inspiration to me, and I'm sure many others, that it's possible to reconstruct women's histories. Palace women who, men weren't allowed in except their sons, etc. But Leslie has shown us that there are ways to reconstruct it. So I'm really glad that this book is out and we can enjoy her talk. All right.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Can everybody hear me? I'm speaking through a mask. It's going to be a little fuzzy, so I'll try and enunciate as clearly as I can in English. So welcome. I'm really happy to be here today. I love Madison. I've got kind of a history with Madison. Did my first CIASI here in 2000 with Ajahn Janpanit. And I think I came back around the time I finished my dissertation and spoke at Tongchai's invitation, but that has to be at least 10 years ago now, which seems an eternity. It is an eternity. So I'm happy to be back, and I'm really happy that my book is finally coming out. So that's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Mainly the subject of my book, who is Princess Dara Rasami, who is one of Chulalongkorn's 153 consorts during his reign. And what I'll be talking about her today is that beyond being one of these consorts and kind of opening up our view of this world, of the Inner Palace, Dara also played a really important political function that highlights kind of the political contingency that Siam was facing in this era, during Chulalongkorn's later reign in particular, from say the 1880s onward. And why it was so contingent was partly because of a rumor that started flowing around Bangkok in 1883 that Queen Victoria actually wanted to adopt Princess Dara Rasami of Lan Na and spirit her back to London and raise her in the palace as her own. Now, there was a precedent for this kind of practice. Even though when I researched this, I went back to the British consular records and the diplomatic records, and the British seem to have very low awareness even of Dara Rasami's existence. And I could find no evidence that such an offer ever actually occurred, but it seems clear that the rumor itself was very keenly felt in Bangkok. And this rumor appears in every biography you read about Dara Rasami. So obviously, people in Thailand believed it was true. The Siamese at the time believed that this rumor was true. And the reason that it was so scary was because, of course, that the British had already been making inroads into Burma, just next door. And there was also a precedent that Queen Victoria had indeed adopted a prince from India and spirited him back to London, where he was raised as sort of a British nobleman. That was Prince Duleep Singh, who was a Maharaja of the Punjab, actually. So there was an existing story on which this rumor seems to have been modeled for Dara Rasami's purposes. But the reason I believe that this rumor was hatched was in order to improve the status of the Lan Na royalty. Now, at this point in history, here's my map. Okay. We're talking about not modern nation states with clear borders drawn around each territory, as per Tong Chai. I'm sure you're all familiar with that thesis. So we're talking about mandala states. And during this era, the 1870s, 1880s, Lan Na and Siam are still separate and sovereign mandala states unto themselves. So Lan Na has its own king and queen, as does Siam, and Dara Rasami is actually the daughter of the king and queen of Lan Na. So when this rumor actually reached Bangkok, it was so distressing to King Chulalongkorn that he put together a delegation to return up to Chiang Mai with a pair of diamond earrings and a miracle offer that Dara Rasami should come down to Bangkok when she became of age and serve as one of his royal consorts. And this was a means of both preventing Queen Victoria from adopting her and cementing a political alliance between Lan Na and Siam at this moment. So preventing Lan Na from falling to the British, essentially, as Burma had next door. And as the French were pushing in from Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam from the east. So we have to keep in mind that this is an era of both high European imperialism and high anxiety on the part of the Siamese that this imperialism is really physically impinging upon their territory. So let's return to Dara Rasami herself. She is born in 1873. So at the time of the rumor and the marital offer, she is all of 9 years old. Now, the plan was for her to become a consort upon reaching puberty, coming of age. So she doesn't actually come down to Bangkok to start service in the palace until she's 13. All of 13, very grown-up 13, as you can imagine. But part of what is really interesting about Dara Rasami's career in particular is that it bookends this era during which Siam and, well, most of Southeast Asia on the mainland moves from the mandala model to the modern nation-state model. And territories become rationalized and mapped. Boundaries and borders become hard and fixed. And yet at the same time, the value of Siamese palace women declines precipitously due to, excuse me, due to the decline in their political currency and their function in terms of cementing these political alliances between the King of Siam and the Mandala kingdoms at his kingdom's peripheries. Right? This is a traditional model of Southeast Asian statecraft that begins to shift right out from under the palace women in this era. So part of what I'm also going to talk about, given that Siam was never formally colonized by any European power, I'm going to talk about something called crypto-colonialism, which is a term coined by Michael Herzfeld, to better describe Siam's experience of a sort of semi-colonialism that is practiced not from without, but from within. And as part of that practice, a worldview evolved during the Chulalongkorn reign called siwilai, the notion of civilization sort of rendered in Siamese terms. Okay, so let me return to Chulalongkorn and all of the consorts. Because as I discussed in my book, over time, the population of the royal harem, if you will, inside the palace grew. From the course of the first reign to the fourth reign, it went from, say, 12 to 2 dozen to maybe 3 dozen consorts, a few more under King Mongkut, and then a lot under King Chulalongkorn. And you might wonder, what is that about? And my theory is that by Chulalongkorn's ascension to the throne in 1868, the political map had already shifted enough with imperial incursion into Southeast Asia that the kingdoms at the peripheries, the nobility outside of Bangkok, started seeing Chulalongkorn as sort of like the regional winner in the competition for royal prestige and power. And so to send their daughters into the Siamese palace accrued great merit to their families, to their daughters, and also gave them political connections with Chulalongkorn, who was seen as a successful king at this point, right? He's hanging on to sovereignty of Siam, and this counts for something. But I want to also talk about the space that the royal women inhabited and within the Siamese palace, which, if you're familiar with central Bangkok, it's on Ratanakosin Island, which is bounded by these waterways. It's kind of hard to tell these days because you just drive right over bridges and it seems like Ratanakosin is just part of the bigger city, but it actually is set off by these clones and bounded on the west by the Chapia River. Now the palace itself, which you can still visit, as far as I know, maybe not right now for COVID purposes, but if you've ever been there, what you have seen are the areas of the outer palace and middle palace where reside the Temple of the Emerald Buddha and other sacred sites. And then when you get to the Chakri Maha Prasat, which I will show you in a moment, there's another boundary line and a wall past which you cannot go. That is the wall around the inner palace. Okay. Within the outer walls, next to the middle palace here, the inner palace is surrounded by a second set of walls within the palace space. Now, the inner palace was entirely and exclusively the space of women. Consorts, their ladies-in-waiting, their servants, but also palace administrators, bureaucrats, and others who worked for the palace and for the crown lived in this space. Men were only permitted under chaperone, and it was only the concubines and their children. And male children actually had to leave upon reaching puberty, and they would be granted their own palace space elsewhere in Bangkok. But until that point, boys and girls grew up together in the palace, in their mother's homes. So let me talk a little bit about the boundary line and this spot that straddles the boundary between the middle and inner palace, the Chakri Maha Prasat. Now this building was built by Chulalongkorn, beginning of his reign, hence the sort of melding of European and Siamese architecture that you see. But this building also functioned as a really interesting sort of interstitial site of Siamese statecraft under Chulalongkorn, because it was both where he conducted his affairs of state on the lower floors that faced the middle palace. But on the upper floors and the rear, those areas actually faced into the inner palace and adjoined them. And those were Chulalongkorn's family spaces. It's where he ate his meals with usually Queen Sawapa and many of his children, and from which he could also enter the inner palace whenever he wanted. So it's a really interesting spot right there on the borderline between these two areas. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, if the Chakri Mahaprasat is on the north end of the inner palace, on the southern side of the inner palace were these row houses called the Tao Teng. This is where the Tao, the ladies who were administrators, actually lived. And they were a lot like row housing with an upper and lower floor, enough space for a woman, the administrator herself and a servant or perhaps two to live. So that they did not have to live outside of the palace. They could be inside the inner palace at all times and kind of on call and at the service of the women there. But as I'll discuss a little later, space and proximity to the palace is everything. So their location on the outermost edge kind of also reflects their social status, that they're kind of the lowest and least likely to cross paths with the royalty in this location. Now, Dara Rasami entered the palace to begin her career in 1886 when she was 13, and was there until Chulalongkorn's death in 1910, and a few years in addition. And after she had a child with King Chulalongkorn, she was granted her own residence, which was built using the money from the Lan Na royalty, which was typically teak forest money. So there was a lot of it. Dara's family was very wealthy. And they could afford to build her this massive 3-story masonry house with enough rooms for not only her ladies in waiting and a few children from her extended family, but also her family visiting from Chiang Mai. When the administrators would come down to pay tribute to Siam, which they did twice a year, they would stay with Dara and her family in her house. So it was pretty big, and it was also in a zone very close to the Chakri Mahaprasat, like the other high queens during Chulalongkorn's era. So Dara did have one child with King Chulalongkorn very early on in her career, and it's my hypothesis that it was really in Chulalongkorn's interest to get her pregnant as quickly as possible after she entered the palace. And so she had her first child at 15, a little girl named Wimon Nakonapisi, who unfortunately died at the age of about 2.5. And Dara did not have any further children with Chulalongkorn. But the real significance of Dara having this child is that the rule was if a royal consort or concubine wanted to leave royal service, she could. Mongkut had publicly made a proclamation about this during his reign, and it was upheld during Chulalongkorn's reign. But once a woman, a royal consort, had a child with the king, she could no longer opt out of palace life. So it was really in Chulalongkorn's best interest for Dara Rasami to have that child as soon as possible, to really lock down the relationship between the two Mandala kingdoms and ensure their loyalty. Because at the same time that Dara was kind of a diplomat in service of her parents' Mandala kingdom, she was also a hostage. And this is important to keep in mind. There is a story that I outlined in my book that there was a secret letter sent to Dara by her father in about 1886. I'm sorry, 1889, before her daughter was born. That her father outlined to her that the Prince of Chiang Mai was looking for a wife, and perhaps Dara should, think about coming home and taking him up on it, whether he was serious or not. Dara was very concerned that this letter could be interpreted as betrayal and disloyalty on the part of her family. And so the story goes, and again, this is another rumor, no documentation, very conveniently, but the story is that she decided at 15 to present this letter to King Chulalongkorn. In other words, to come clean and make sure that he understood that she was not in on this deal, that she was not part of this, even if the consequences to her father should be negative. And the story went that when Chulalongkorn responded, he wrote a letter to her father, to King Intanon in Chiang Mai, saying that if the king wanted to come down from Chiang Mai and collect his daughter from Bangkok, he was welcome to, but he should be prepared to collect her body. Which is not really a fun place to be in your relationship with your husband when you are just discovered that you are pregnant with his child. So there was apparently a time, according to the same story, that Dara was in fear for her life, that she understood very keenly the nature of this relationship, that it was not purely diplomatic, it wasn't all fun and games, it wasn't a luxury existence in the palace, but rather, your life could literally be at stake, and you had to really tread very carefully within palace politics to ensure that you remain safe and be considered loyal. But Dara made it, and upon the birth of her child, she was allowed to gather an entourage within her residence of ladies-in-waiting, which she drew largely from the Chiang Mai elites and noble families. And when they came to her residence, all of Dara's ladies-in-waiting were required to maintain their dress and hairstyle as Lan Na women, which is, reflected in this photograph, where you see everyone is wearing this sort of white blouse-like garment on the top, which was very popular in the 1870s, early 1880s, Lan Na, as well as pasin. So instead of wearing chongkaban, as royal Siamese women did on the bottom, which are more trouser-like, Chiang Mai women, Lan Na women wore the pasin, which is essentially a tube skirt, right, or a wrapped textile. Often with a lower hem bordered with tinjok, which is a supplemental weft, separately woven textile that also is very complex to produce and very expensive. And so it was definitely a marker of her eliteness to wear these textiles. But at the same time, it made her and her ladies-in-waiting very visually distinctive within the palace, which led to some teasing and humiliation. There was definitely difficulty caused by Dara's ethnic difference. But here I want to show you some examples of Lan Na textiles and kind of the traditional style of the mid-19th century. These are from the collector in Chiang Mai. There's a nice close-up of tinjok. There are several different patterns, depending on what village or what town the tinjok comes from. You can still obtain this in Thailand, in northern Thailand today. But to return to Dara's women, okay, now here's Dara up here in the upper left-hand corner, and a young girl, and you will notice in several of these photos that even though by this time Dara's daughter has passed away, there are always several children in her residence, as she would foster members of her extended family. Apparently one of her cousins in Lan Na in Chiang Mai who died left 2 children behind, and they were sent down to Dara's residence to be raised by her. She even paid for their European educations later on. But here I wanted to show you, I believe this is at Ayutthaya, at Bangkain, where King Chulalongkorn built a residence, and residences for several of his favorite women, and Dara was one of them. So here you can see her ladies-in-waiting here in this group, and a few Siamese administrative staff here who would have been assigned to her household on the right. You can tell they're Siamese by their hairstyle and their chongkaban. But everyone is wearing stockings and shoes. Everyone's very modern here. You can see the tinjok in the textiles and the pasin worn by Dara's women here. So I want to talk a little bit also about what women's lives were like generally inside the Inner Palace, because, well, nobody has written about this. When I first struck upon Dara's story, I was astounded to discover how much we did not know about palace women in traditional pre-modern Siam. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about that and give you an idea of what the day-to-day life of women was like in this unique space. And women fulfilled all kinds of roles in this space, from low to high. Amongst the higher ranking women, well, there were ranks available up to the queenly ranks, which were bestowed by King Chulalongkorn. But outside of those kind of special ranks, there were all kinds of opportunities for women to earn rank promotions over their time in the palace. And so there were women who were assigned to the royal kitchens, to the royal wardrobe, to the royal perfumes. These were roles that were much closer to the king and his household, and were deemed very high status. So there were women like, this is one of the Bunag sisters in the kitchens. But then there were also, in addition to the day-to-day jobs, the work of life and living in the palace, the consorts did actually have some fun, and there were green spaces and gardens where they could picnic, play games, sit in the shade outside of their residences. There are actually some good pictures. This is the old palace. Because at a certain point, around the turn of the 20th century, Chulalongkorn, having returned from his travels in Europe, decided to build a new palace outside of the grounds of the Grand Palace, which is where Viman Mek Mansion comes from, up in the Dusit district. And his new sort of royal campus was called Suan Dusit, as in Dusit Park, right? And that was where he built residences for not only himself and his high queens, but several other of his favorite consorts, and Dara was awarded a residence there as well. But as I mentioned earlier, this era is one in which the mandala becomes rationalized into something different, something new, along European lines. And in the Siamese context, it goes from mandala to monton. Right? During the 1890s, Chulalongkorn begins setting out map makers and bureaucrats to map the territories and begin to think of it in more European terms. Not only that, but to assign bureaucrats and administrators to each of these places. And this is a completely new form of governance within Siam. Right? This is totally opposite of the mandala model, where a mandala at the periphery could just pay tribute to the center. Now, this means there are Siamese administrators now on the ground in all of these monton, to one degree or another. But as part of this new way of thinking about the space of the state, there's also a new way of thinking about the lifestyle and the nature of Siamese elite life itself. And under Chulalongkorn, the thinking was a new worldview called siwilai, in which Siamese elites were attempting to align themselves with what they saw as sort of a new global order, in which being civilized was the goal. Right? And this is directly influenced by European imperialism. But in this case, what I really want to emphasize is sort of the way that this is expressed visually. And under Chulalongkorn, we have a treasure trove of amazing photography that reflects this. This is also not least influenced by Chulalongkorn's travels outside of Siam. He is the first Siamese monarch to actually leave Siam, visit other parts of South and Southeast Asia, and ultimately Europe, where he observed very keenly the practices of European colonizers. Right after Mongkut's death and after Chulalongkorn ascended the throne in 1868, he was still under a regent, but he decided to undertake some local travels. He went to Batavia in Indonesia, he went to Singapore, and then he also traveled to India, looking particularly at the colonial modes of governance there, and adopting and adapting as he went. And part of this is reflected in the photographic portraits that he and his ministers took along the way. This one was taken in Singapore. And you can see here's Chulalongkorn right in the center. Interestingly, he is seated. He is not above everyone else. Oops. And everyone is, of course, dressed in a very siwilai fashion, right? European suits, hats, sometimes military uniform, pith helmet. Even the children are part of this visual expression of what it means to be siwilai. This is what it is to dress as a siwilai Siamese. Oops, come back here. Yes, I love this picture because it's Chulalongkorn basically dropping off all of his sons to be educated in Britain at a particular moment, and dressing them all in matching top hats and top coats, and being photographed with them in range of size. So siwilai. This is also reflected in the royal portraiture of the time, which was often taken with the intention of circulation in Europe. But Chulalongkorn also adapted the Siamese military uniforms and began also during this era to assign different styles and colors to the different ministries of the government. But here you can see the sort of siwilai interpretation of dress, where what is on top, this military style jacket, the Raja Patan, right, adapted from the British Raj, from European style, in combination though with Concubines, right? But also stockings and shoes to reflect modernity. Also pith helmet, right? Directly adapted from European military uniform. But the women also got in on this act. This is Queen Sawapa, and she also has adapted her dress, as did many Siamese elite women in this era, to this sort of siwilai model. Only for women, the way it shaped up was a very lacy Victorian-style blouse. Here she's, showing the leg of mutton sleeve, very fashionable at the time, but paired with chongkaban, stockings and shoes. Also, she's still sporting the short flank haircut, unlike Dara's long hair and muay bun. But Dara also becomes enlisted in this project of building Siamese siwilai in this era. And as I discuss in my book, she plays a role in terms of helping to set up an ethnic hierarchy within the palace and within this mindset of siwilai. And here you can see in photography, like here is Dara positioned out in one of the green spaces of the palace in what I think of as a pastoral pose, where she's looking off into the distance sort of dreamily. I think of it as depicting her as pining for the forests of Lan Na, right? But she appears in other portraits in different sort of siwilai modes as well. And here she is pictured with a stereograph viewer, which was very famously gifted to her by King Chulalongkorn during that time. But notice she is still wearing a pasin with tinjo, although this time the textile is actually a Burmese muntaya pattern. So even though on top she is similar to Sawapa with a lacy Victorian blouse, there are parts of her Lan Na costume that are apparently not adaptable, that remain consistent through this era. One of which is the pasin, but the other which is her hairstyle. She had very long hair. This is a traditional Lan Na women's hairstyle, worn pulled up at the back of the head into a bun. And so you see her appear in various palace photography of this era, both with other Siamese elites. This is out at Dusit, at the new palace. I think that the palace was receiving its first shipment of Fords. So the automobile was definitely a mark of siwilai. But you might be wondering, why we have this not only a trove of photography, but so many photographs of women. Is because women were actually taking many of these photographs within the palace. I've written an article entitled Concubines of Cameras, where I really dive deep on this. So if you want to read more about that, you can find it online. But here, this is an image actually of the 5 Bunag sisters, the sisters of the Bunag family, who had a long relationship with the Siamese crown. I mean, basically ever since the Ayutthaya era, there had been Bunags serving in very high posts in the Siamese administration. And this era was really no different. Here, Herb Bunak, one of those 5 women, is photographing her father, who was High Minister during Chulalongkorn's reign. And she and several of her sisters became royal consorts during this time, following around the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And they kind of mark a sea change in terms of palace culture, as does the move out to Cape Dusit by the royalty. And it also marks a shift in how palace women's roles signify. As I mentioned before, the mandala model and the need for consorts as political ties is diminishing during this era as the montan is built, as a new administrative structure is built. So women's political currency is dropping in value like a stone. And yet their cultural value is gaining a new kind of currency. And this is what I think is going on with these photographs. And Dara's role here as an ethnic other within the palace plays a particular role. And here, Herb Bunak actually is responsible for taking a series of portraits of Dara, probably for the Wat Benjamapopid photography competition in 1905, that showcases her ethnic difference from Siamese women. And here, let me show you the series. Although, let me show you, this is where it's set up, because if you don't have all of the photos together, you might never know. This is actually set up on the lawn of Viman Meg Mansion in Dusit, because of course there was no such thing as interior electric lighting at this point in Siam, and the flash was kind of notoriously unreliable. So the best lighting for photography was really outdoor. So this is all set up out on the lawn for lighting purposes. But Herb has put together a tableau that would be right at home in any Victorian woman's toilette. A dressing table, a chair, and some strategically positioned mirrors. Actually, if you look carefully at the reflections here, you can tell that they're not inside a building. You can see the lawn and the trees behind them. But in these photos, Dara is really showcasing probably the most striking feature of her Lan Na ness, which is her hair. Right, so she's taking down her hair from its bun on her head, and Herb is very carefully, consciously posing her so that her face can be seen in the mirror's reflections, even when she's not facing the camera. But her hair is like all the way down, very long hair. And Dara is a willing participant in this process. I mean, I think it would have been a little difficult for her to turn down Herb, but her status was higher, so I think she could have said no. But I think that, interestingly, Dara saw a particular value in her ethnic difference within the palace that was growing, that had gotten, it had gained traction from the start of her palace career, as opposed to losing traction. In fact, she is enlisted by Prince Naret in 1909 to help him create the Siamese adaptation of Madame Butterfly, Phra, where Dara herself, a Lan Na woman, is the template for the tragic heroine. Now, in the original version, it's an American naval soldier and a Japanese woman as the tragic heroine. In the Siamese adaptation, I think this is very interesting from a siwilai point of view. The romantic lead male is a Siamese soldier who has come to Chiang Mai, and the tragic heroine is a Lan Na woman, based directly on Dara Rasami. And Prince Naret actually asked Dara for help, which she provided in terms of helping his wife learn the Lan Na dance moves, for traditional Lan Na music to introduce to the work, and also for the dress and hair sported by the main heroine. And this play became a massive hit in Bangkok in 1909. So even though this notion of siwilai and ethnic difference had been gaining currency within the palace, you might think, well, who knew about this outside the palace? from 1909 onward, everybody outside the palace knew about it. I mean, suddenly it became part of pop culture to think of Lan Na in this crypto-colonial way, right, as being subject to the colonial predations of the Siamese in Chiang Mai. And so Dara, fits really neatly into the role of this tragic heroine. At the same time, Dara's career fortunes also take a turn for the better. After 20 plus years at the lowly rank of consort mother, which was a rank given to any woman who had a child with King Chulalongkorn, she was finally promoted to the rank of Phra Jaya, which is a very high rank. She made her one of the 4 high queens under Chulalongkorn's reign, the only one who was not one of his half-sisters. She's actually promoted after leaving town for the first time in 1909, when she's finally granted a visit home by King Chulalongkorn. This is the first time in all the years she lived in the palace that she was allowed to leave and return to Chiang Mai, which she did for nearly the whole year. It was like a 9-month journey, which at that point was pretty difficult because the rail lines had just been established and only ran about as far as, I think, maybe Pitsanulok. I don't even think that far in 1909. But in any event, it took several weeks for her to make the entire journey there and return. It was not an easy thing. But in seeing her off at the Samsen train station in Bangkok, Dara did a gesture that has kind of lived on in, in her legend and in the history of the palace. And we believe that this is what resulted in her promotion, was that on saying farewell to King Chulalongkorn, she took down her hair and knelt down, and the gesture is washing his feet with her hair and her tears, which is drawn from Lilit Prala and also from some Burmese literature. So it is a uniquely Lan Na gesture to make. And this is just upon getting on the train and saying goodbye. So it isn't until she gets to Chiang Mai that Chulalongkorn actually sends up, he decides to promote her after she's gone and sends it up to her after the fact. And that's when this particular portrait is actually taken by the photographer Tanaka, a Japanese photographer in Chiang Mai at that time. And here she's wearing her royal jewels and also is showcasing the royal beetle box that's part of her royal promotion. But of course, after Chulalongkorn's death in 1910, polygamy takes a precipitous dive in terms of royal practice in Siam. Even though Rama VI, King Vajirahut, had written essays decrying royal polygamy, he ultimately ended up taking far more than one wife in an attempt to conceive a royal heir. But when he did not succeed and he passed away in 1925, the throne devolved to his younger brother, Prasat, who had one wife and one wife only. So by 1925, Siamese kings have effectively become monogamous. Royal polygamy has fallen by the wayside completely. Dara has returned by then to Chiang Mai to embark on a post-retirement career that's really interesting because it plays again on Lan Na's ethnic difference and separateness from Siam. She becomes a kind of a patron, a matron, if you will, of Lan Na dance, music, and weaving. And she remains close to the Siamese royalty and throne, such that she even plays a big part in Prajatipok's royal visit to Chiang Mai in 1927, where you can see her up here coming out of the temple with the royal party, and here at Wat Suandok, adjacent to the royal cemetery. This is the cemetery for Lan Na royalty. But I wanted to particularly show you a couple of images of her dance troupe for which she recruited young women and girls from all levels of society in and around Chiang Mai. But just to showcase their very Burmese style, Shan style dress. And a lot of the moves and music in Lan Na style bear a very distinct Burmese influence from the colonial experience that they had at the time. And here, Dara's visit back to Chiang Mai in 1909 actually had additional sort of cultural reverberations there as well, where her dress style was actually adopted by elite women of Chiang Mai, but also the teachers at the Dara school, which at that point had been set up by missionaries. And it was during the 1909 visit that they asked Dara for permission to use her name, as they had recently named the boys' school Prince Royal College after Prince Vajiraput. So the two were seen as, you know, companion schools to each other, but both with royal Siamese kind of connections. But subsequently, in the 1920s, both before and after Prajapipok's visit to Chiang Mai, a fad came up in Bangkok for Lan Na style passing in particular amongst elite women. And I think this is due to, well, the fact that finally the rail lines are completed between Bangkok and Chiang Mai, I think in 1922. Dara's friendship with Prince Damrong brings him to Chiang Mai a number of times in the 1920s. And when he returns to Bangkok, it's always with his daughters entirely garbed in Lan Na clothing, such that it sparked a fad amongst the elites of Siam, who are here showcased, you know, again, Hasin on the bottom, 1920s flapper style on the top, plus stockings and shoes. So in a sense, Lan Na had come full circle from being, you know, the mark of backwards people in the palace to being the mark of wealthy elite Siamese who could afford to take the train and become tourists in the north. But if you talk to Lan Na people today, they think of Dara's style as being timelessly, you know, Lan Na. And this style has come from time immemorial, when in fact, it was really kind of invented by Dara about, you know, 100 years ago. But it's still very much current. When you go to celebrations and festivals today, as you can see, women wearing the traditional pasin, all kinds of different colorways, and also maintaining and continuing Dara's dance traditions, utilizing the same moves and some of the songs that she made sort of standard Lan Na culture at that time. So that's where I'm going to wrap up for today. And I welcome your questions. So thank you very much.